Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I have a great guest and a good friend, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. In fact, many of you are probably only familiar with me because of his channel, so it's awesome. Hold on, sorry. I had the stream going. Sorry about that. Okay, so just want to get started here. My guest today is, of course, Academic Agent. Thank you for joining me, sir.
Yes, thanks a lot, Aaron. Although I think as the Phil Collins of our space, you run yourself down, Aaron. Even Tucker Carlson knows who you are.
It has been very odd, but again, I am very grateful for, we all have to travel a road to get there, and many great people, including yourself and the Distributist and others, certainly helped along the way. So I am very grateful. It's a great community. There's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of working together, and I'm glad to see it. And you're certainly one of the big pillars of it. So it's great to finally have you on, because of course you've had me on many times. But today we're going to be talking about your new book, The Populist Delusion. If anyone is unfamiliar with the book, I don't know what you've been doing. I, of course, have the links below. You should absolutely go buy a book immediately. But I always start the same way, and I actually don't know this part of your story, AA, so I certainly
Mhm.
want to hear it. How did you get started? I know you've got a background in academia, but maybe a little more about how you get started in that and how it transitioned to YouTube and how it's kind of
Mhm.
led you to the book. How did this all kind of come about?
Yeah, I've often thought about that myself because I don't quite know how all that happened. I was never that politically engaged when I was in my 20s. Uh, I'm going to be turning 40 later this year to give you an idea of my age. And I spent most of the Tony Blair years, ironically, kind of politically checked out. Like, just I was just not that engaged. I'd keep an eye on what was going on. Um, so when I say I wasn't politically engaged, I mean, let's face it, I was still probably in like the top 5% of people who knew what was going on. But I just didn't really have that many strong positions on anything. Um, because I was into culture. I was into things like music and film, and I was I found politics all a bit kind of how can I say? Well, I mean, in the Tony Blair era, all the politicians were the same for a start. So it was like a choice between three different flavors of the same vanilla ice cream, if you want to put it that way. Um, so I didn't really have that strong a sense. Like, was I right wing? Was I left wing? I knew a few things. Like, I knew I hated the Guardian, for example, um, and that I was irritated. Having grown up watching Roots and crying and feeling outrage at the injustice of what's that film? To Kill a Mockingbird. You ever seen that?
Yes.
I felt the rage and the injustice as a 12-year-old, as a 13-year-old. By the time you take all of that for red. What, you're still going on about all of that? That's tiresome. I mean, I found it really irritating when people started going on and on and on about racism and sexism. I was like, what are you talking about? You just take that stuff for red. And I think people forget this now, but by the early 2000s, um, in comedy in the UK at least, I don't know if I think this happened in America as well. Things had kind of come around so that the comedy was actually very politically incorrect, but in an ironic way. Does that make any sense? So if you can remember somebody like Ricky Gervais,
Hmm.
he would poke open fun at disabled people with the knowledge that it was politically incorrect to do so, and that we all knew that it was wrong. But because we all knew that, it kind of became funny again. Does that make any sense? Um, and so that was the kind of environment I grew up in. So when this rather shrill new form of political correctness really started taking hold in the mid 2010s, I would say, I really didn't like that at all. I thought it was just, I thought it was passé. I thought it was, I mean, before the politics, I just thought it was just cringe, is what we'd say now. It was just, it was lame. You know, it wasn't. How could a generation who grew up watching fucking South Park now be like it was so earnest? Do you know what I mean by that? Like I had come from this very cynical Gen Xy sort of background where, you know, everything was with a slightly raised eyebrow, everything was a little bit arch, and now all of a sudden we had like actual SJWs, and I found the aesthetic of it very displeasing, to say the least, when that started happening. Um, and then I remember Brexit happened, and I don't think I've ever told this story. I was actually at a conference in Oxford, um, and it was one of those, you know, academic conference. I was wearing my little scarf and my tweed jacket, poncing along, and I remember the news came in. Oh, you know, the referendum happened, and I stopped and I shed a little tear. Right, this sounds ridiculous. I actually voted Remain in that in 2016. Um, I was touch and go, but I heard a speech by David Cameron, and it made me it kind of pushed me over the edge. And I voted Remain on the day, something for which my wife has still not forgiven me. She thought because she kind of like Nigel Farage and things like that. And I just had this sense that nothing would ever be the same again from that moment. And I also felt that something odd was happening because I, like many people, I think, had treated it as a genuine discussion with arguments for and against. And you know, we had the debates on the television, and you know, and okay, so be it the best, you know, that team won, you know, and the Leave vote won. The reaction of the establishment in Britain, of the media, of the chattering classes, of friends of mine, of academics, um, was so hysterical, so earth-shatteringly insane that I felt something deeply wrong was going on, and I wanted to know more about it. And that kind of set me off on this little journey to try to figure out what the hell was going on and why people I previously respected were literally just losing their minds around me. Um, and at the same time as all of this was going on, of course, we had this very shrill SJW culture happening. And I had for a while quietly been watching Sargon of Akkad videos. And I remember watching his magnum opus. I don't know if you remember it, the Why People Hate Feminism series, long time ago now. And you know, being an academic, I was very au fait with the works of Louis Althusser and Foucault and the Frankfurt School and all of these people he was referring to. And when Sargon kept on saying Michael Foucault, I was like, I was like, maybe I could just jump in and lend a hand here, just to get people up to speed with some of the new left, and some of these kind of I wouldn't. The phrase cultural Marxist has been tabooed now. But back then you would have just said like Marxism after the cultural turn, you know, the new left of the 1960s, you know, the French new left after Foucault, and the American new left who very much followed the Frankfurt School, Adorno and Horkheimer and some of these people. And that was what I did. I made a series introducing people to the fundamental principles of the left and a lot of their annoying kind of tropes and things like that, and how to argue against them. And that was when I really started to think, well, hang on a second, what do I really stand for? Because up until that point, I'd always said, well, I'm just a pragmatist. Like, for example, like unlike a lot of people in our spheres, I supported the Iraq War. Um, And I did so knowing fully well that there were no weapons of mass destruction, and that it was just a cynical, whether it was for oil or for security interests or whatever the real reasons were. I was completely all right with that kind of Machiavellian frame. I had read a book by Robert Kagan called Of Paradise and Power. And to my eternal shame, I had voted for Tony Blair in 2001, which I will never live down. And I mean, in many ways, my YouTube channel is a testament to my kind of what do Christians call it? Salvation, repentance. I'm trying to like atone my
Yes,
atonement,
your
my
atonement.
atonement. um, and so really, that's how I started on YouTube, and I guess the journey has led me here. So.
Yeah, it's really interesting because we're more or less the same age, and even though I grew up on the other side of the ocean, I had a very similar timeline. I was always a little more right wing because I just grew up conservative Christian, but it didn't have a I didn't think about it a lot. I took all the received wisdom. I just kind of fell to my default teams, and I didn't really search deeper into that. Like you, I supported the Iraq War, whatever that means when you're like
Mhm.
20. I remember being in college and like knocking on doors for George W. Bush, college Republican, that kind of thing. And
Mhm.
so but then at the same time, we with different events, be it Brexit or Donald Trump, very interesting that both nations kind of experience this amazing example of how politics does not work the way it's supposed to, how the
Yeah.
elites will manipulate and shift and change the rules, and will do it in the open if necessary, and a
Mhm.
lesson to anyone who's paying attention. And so for a lot of people, us included, those events really shook the foundations, and make you go looking elsewhere to how power actually
Y-
functions.
Yeah, I should also mention as well, as part of this little story, my mother, who is from a working class background from a Welsh town. I should have mentioned I grew up in Wales. Okay, now in Wales, you just vote Labour. Okay, it's just not even a question. It's like there's no Tory. Like in the rest of the country, it's Tory Labour, but in Wales, especially if you're from a mining background, you just vote Labour. Okay, that's actually been broken to some extent now in the past 10 years or so, but it was always the case. Okay. Um, and so I, all the way after I voted for Blair in 2001, I couldn't bring myself to vote Tory. First time I actually voted Tory was, again, to my eternal shame, for Theresa May. Do you remember her? Oh,
Mhm.
God. And that was because at the time, I thought that Jeremy Corbyn was going to be like a fate worse than death, like an actual old school socialist communist. Looking back, we probably should have voted for him just on the foreign policy stuff alone. But um, so yeah, that was a big emotional. I don't really talk about that, but it was quite a big barrier to overcome. Just the kind of, because you feel like you're betraying your roots in a sense to cross that line. And I understand that in some areas of the US it's a bit like that as well, right? You're either team blue or you're team red type thing.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's there's not like any politics behind it. It's just like tribal in a way. But anyway, my mother, all the way during the Brexit stuff, she was a pretty hardcore Brexiteer. She also got on the Trump train. She massively got on the Trump train. She was watching all his rallies and all that sort of stuff. I thought she was mad. And I
Hmm.
remember the night that the Trump won, I'd got like, because I'm, a politics nerd, so I got my Doritos and my cornbread and stuff in root beer. I thought I'd make a night of it. And just remember, in a little group chat with my brother and my mother, and when he won, I just thought it was hilarious. And I just remember sending a picture of two like kind of like toothless hillbilly kind of rednecks to my mother, as if to say, like, these are these are your people. They've won. Are you happy now? Type thing. But then, um, what? when the reaction to Trump was, I mean, I remember Trump gave a speech where he said it's going to be Brexit times 10. Do you remember when he said that? And then it was.
Yeah.
And then the level of hysteria from the media, from the chattering classes. I mean, it was just like all hell had broken loose. And from that moment on, I'm of the, you know, how can I put this? So, I mean, part of my reason for supporting the Iraq War was because it was trendy. It was trendy to oppose it when I was in college. Everybody went to the anti-war protests. I thought that was cringe. So the kind of contrarian in me ended up on the other side of it, probably for the wrong, right? But now this had happened, I could actually see something was deeply wrong with the reaction to Trump, because I had watched some of the rallies, I had watched some of the speeches, and the media were just telling outright lies on an almost daily basis. And I think people forget how wild this was back then now, because we've lived it all. But like back then, you didn't have politicians just like fucking dunking each other on Twitter, and people would have a shot at Trump and he just like own them 10 times worse back on Twitter. And he gave those outrageous interviews where he'd say the media is the enemy of the people and so on and so forth. And this kind of weird cascade happened where every time the media would try to own Trump would come back, and then everybody would look in. I remember this moment. Anybody who's halfway educated, well, they just look things up and they do a bit of research, as I'm sure you did, Auron, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, hold on a second. That thing Trump just said, all right, he may have embellished a bit, but there's something there. There's nothing there. The media are trying to say there's nothing there, but actually, he's telling the truth. Why is Baltimore such a shithole? Oh, what is happening in Paris? And it's just like he had this way of shining a light on actual real issues that people cared about, that the media were, lying about. And so I think that was an interesting journey, I guess. Although if we go through every nook and cranny of 2016, 2017, we'll never get to the book, Aaron. So.
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say you are hitting on something really important about Trump there, though, because for all of Trump's faults, the thing that he did that I think really endeared him to a generation that felt completely ignored by politicians and their interests is, every year, especially on the Republican side, but they, of course, both sides do this, right? Every election is the last election of our lifetime. It's the most important election of our lifetime, and you absolutely have to get out there and vote, because if you don't, it's the end of the republic, and it's the end of civilization. And then as soon as these people get elected, they just go back to like going to the same cocktail parties and treating each other. They take pictures, sitting at, fancy, plays or movie premieres, laughing and chuckling together. And you get the sense that these people actually don't hate each other at all. And they've been working together, but you're told that actually like they hate each other, and this is do or die every time. And then Trump gets in office and he like actually treats the opposition like they're a problem. Like he actually treats them like they aren't working in the interests of the country. And he's more than willing to say the things that you're not supposed to say. He's more than willing to point those out. And every time, he says them, people go and they run and they clutch their pearls and they lose their minds. But then what happens is they start looking into those things, and actually, like you said, obviously many times he's saying things that are factually inaccurate at the moment, but they have large amounts of truth behind them. And once you start going into it, you realize, oh no, we're touching on something very deep. And this created a ton of personal loyalty, to the point where in my area is so red, there are still houses that are completely decorated top to bottom in Donald Trump stuff. Like you just walk by, like it's not a yard sign or something they left up after the campaign. I mean, 10, 15, 20 different things, banners and signs and flags. People still drive around my neighborhood with Trump Pence flags flying off the back of their pickup truck. And when I was, in my former life as a journalist, I covered one of Trump's rallies, and I'm standing, in the press box with a bunch of people from like CNN and stuff, and they're just the whole crowd is just booing in unison, just chanting and
Mhm.
screaming, and you understand like what, you go out and you interview these people, and it's another world. Like the amount of personal loyalty, a lot of people just say, oh, the Republican Party has moved beyond Trumpism, and I get it, whatever, okay. But I've seen these people, and these people are here for Trump, and they're not here for whatever the GOP is selling.
Mhm.
And Trump is the right at this point, and these people have a lot of personal loyalty to him. And it's the way he handled these things for the first time, just having someone who is adjacent to the ruling class signal that they might actually care and take their concerns seriously and not treat the rest of the ruling class like they're their buddies, made a huge difference for people.
Yeah, I mean, I think um, one of the things because as an academic, I want to know, well, why has this happened? Okay, and there were all sorts of big think pieces. If you're big brain journalists giving their like two penny takes, and I remember reading a lot around that time, 2016, early 2017, and none of the none of the takes really spoke to what was happening at all. If you remember, the left had this idea that the Trump voter was, it's the anguish cry of the left behind. Remember that whole narrative? I'm like, is that really what's happening here? I mean, yeah, the Rust Belt was part of it, but is this just an economic issue? Because they try to paint it as an economic problem first and foremost, not as something. Because I think Trump's ace card was always the culture wars, you know, not the economic. And if you actually looked into, well, who actually voted for Trump, it wasn't like the worst off. They actually, in fact, the average Trump voter on paper is fairly affluent, or small business owners, you know, uh, some of the, I can imagine Auron, that some of those people with their Trump Pence flags and so on have some decent houses, right? It's not like they are, um,
It's the
you know,
kulaks.
yeah, they're cool. Yeah, they're kulaks. Exactly. They're not like destitute.
Mhm.
In the way that someone like the Guardian was trying to make out.
Well,
I
sorry,
actually,
I don't want
yeah.
to interrupt you here, but I just want to amplify what you're saying here. The thing people don't understand is the guys with the pickup trucks flying Trump Pence flags off the back. They're the guys who own their construction company, right?
Mhm.
They're not poor, but they're not from the educated class. They're people who grew to the middle or upper middle class outside of the system, outside of the patronage that's required by most other corporations and other things to get to the Democratic Party.
I think kulak is the perfect
Right.
designation. Yeah, independent small business owner, you might want to say. Um, but um, I remember there was two books from back then that stuck with me, and it also kind of made me realize. I think I remember reading. I think it was Russell Kirk who said that being on the right or being a conservative isn't an ideology. It's just like a disposition. It's almost something like you're born with. And I just kind of realized through the whole process of reading, I was like, hold on, I agree with that. I grew up listening to talk radio, and I was probably just like default right wing without even realizing it. You just don't self-identify. Do you know what I mean? Like, you have positions that chime with you, but because you're living in such a culture that's so saturated by um, left-wing ideology, you never think, oh well, I'm going to come right out and say I'm a rightist, I'm a proud conservative, whatever, because it just never occurs to you. You never. It's just like, oh, these are just individual policy things. Whereas that whole journey, I read a book called The Somewheres and the Anywheres. It was called The Road to Somewhere by David Goodhart. Now, if you read that today, you'd think it was very milk toast. But he had this whole thesis that the current divide that we're seeing in society is between a class of anywheres, these dislocated people who can move to New York or Tokyo or San Francisco or Toronto, they'd be perfectly happy. Doesn't matter where they are because they have a mobile identity. Okay, they're a part of the professional class. In fact, probably the likes of me and you, Auron, would be classed as certainly I was, like well, hello, I'm an academic. I belong to this university. But if I moved to that university in a completely different country, I'd be exactly the same person because I have what is known as an achieved identity, they called it. And your identity is basically your CV. And it goes with you wherever you are. Okay. Versus the somewheres, who are people who basically just stay in their hometown and they feel a sense of belonging to that hometown. And I went on a strange, so I would say I'm still quote unquote an anywhere. And I grew up under Tony Blair. We were kind of taught to have a disdain for these people. Oh, what? You don't want to, when I was a teenager, I just couldn't wait to move out of the little town I grew up in. I have to get to London. Come on, I listen to David Bowie and the Smiths. I can't hang around you losers. I have to get out of here. That was kind of, but that was also kind of encouraged in you. What, you're not going to university? What's wrong with you? Do you just want to be a bin man or what? That was the whole attitude of that era that was kind of inculcated in us. But as I got older, I came to really appreciate those somewhere people. And I think one of the biggest things that I've learned is that, well, not everybody's like me. And actually I've got this weird thing where I end up sympathizing with, realizing that most people aren't you and don't want those same things as you. Actually, most people really care about belonging to a hometown, what happens there. They don't want to see it change. They don't, and so I really came to think that um, the hysterical reaction to Brexit and Trump was actually the first time that these anywhere people had ever taken an L on anything in our lifetimes. I mean, probably the last one was Nixon, if we're honest. Um, and so that was another large part of my realization that even though on paper and kind of in my personality and so on, I am an anywhere, my sympathy is always with the quote unquote somewheres. There was another book that was written by Roger Scruton called Where We Are that came out just after Brexit happened, and that also really spoke to me on a kind of deep and personal level as well. And I think they were kind of foundational for my journey to where I am to where I am now. But we can talk about the book if you'd like.
Yeah. No, we'll get to that very next. I just want to hearing that story makes me think about Christopher Lasch and how he talks about how our system was designed to basically lift the somewhere talent and basically centralize it into the empire, right? Like you pull the talent out of the hinterlands and you turn them into anywheres so that they can be standardized and placed in positions of management anywhere in the empire, and that keeps the provinces from kind of revolting because you're skimming all of the talent out of them, right? And you're making sure that they can become kind of widgets that are going to be placed appropriately into centers of power in the machine.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to put it in Pareto terms, I guess what I'm saying is that I'm a class 1, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I come from a class 2 type area and background. But the weird thing is that when you do come from a background like that, even if you are a class 1, your sympathy, well, my mother is probably a class 2. My brother probably is a class, everybody I know is probably, of that type. And so I don't think you ever leave your home behind in the way that the elites imagine you might. So there is a kind of inbuilt flaw to their plan, I suppose, because I just wonder how many other people there are like me who, end up being dislocated from where they were from, but actually end up being a traitor to the regime, as I am, because my loyalty is to the sticks where I came from.
Yeah, it's kind of a similar thing. My family is all from the deep south, and I grew up on military bases, so we moved every couple of years, but I was surrounded obviously by lions, right? Like that was the culture 100% of the time. And so even though, I was deracinated in the sense that we were constantly moving, we went back and saw the family in the deep south, multiple times every year, and I was surrounded by people who are deeply patriotic, deeply loyal, the very very martial in their character. And so I think that similar thing. Well, my disposition would be class one. I grew up to highly value and respect class two people. But that said, let's go ahead and get into what we're talking about here. So you wrote The Populist Delusion. I just want to set this up for people. Obviously, if there's a problem in American or UK politics, you get together, you make signs, you go out, you protest, you get the people together in organizations and local meetings. You make arguments in the public square. People hear those, they become sympathetic, and eventually the American politicians or the UK politicians, their hearts and minds are reached, and the democratic process takes hold, and your values, your issue becomes ascendant. Right? This is how politics is done. This is how it's supposed to work. But then we look at the examples in both of our countries that we just talked about, and we see how starkly that doesn't necessarily happen, and how much it can break. But it seems like as much as people will look at the system, and as broken as they think the system might be, every single time, even the people who diehard Trump supporters, diehard people who are looking at the system and thinking it's ridiculous, still approach it the same way. They still think that they're going to have their own kind of civil rights 1960s style political movement. Why are they wrong? What can the things that you've researched tell us about why this movement won't work the way they want it to? Why do people keep going back to this even when the evidence around them might tell them otherwise?
Well, I mean, the reason people go back to it is because it is or has been the dominant ideology that we all, it's the waters that we swim in, as Curtis Yarvin might say, right? We're surrounded by liberal democracy all the time. And so we imagine that, all we have to do is convince enough people. I mean, I always go back to there's this Ludwig von Mises, right? He's got a book on liberalism, and there's a really quaint moment in it where, I mean, any of us reading it would just be shaking our heads, where he just says, "Oh, so why do we support democracy then?" Well, it's just a case of we engage them in argument, and if we convince the most amount of people, we win. I mean, it's just like, well, that is not how it has worked at all, and that is never how it has worked. I think a lot of people have this notion that, oh, right, well, we had all these freedoms, we had all this liberal democracy. It's just the system didn't like Trump, right? It didn't like Trump, and it didn't really want Brexit, so it kind of closed in to stop that happening. But in other times, like, if you go back to the 60s and 70s, it was all working as it should have back then. But in fact, democracy has never functioned as it is supposed to on paper. It is always an organized minority who are outmaneuvering and controlling the disorganized majority, and they can pick them off one by one. There's this passage I quote from Mosca somewhere, where he says the 100 who are unified are stronger than the 1,000 who are disorganized. Right? Always. The 100 who are unified will defeat the 1,000 10 times out of 10, because they can isolate each one of those 1,000, pick them off one by one. And basically, democracy or liberal democracy tells everybody actually that it's the 1,000 who has the power, not the 100. Whereas that is not true. In fact, um, it's even more stark than that, because they choose your choices. For one, they actually frame who you can choose from: the red guy or the blue guy. What if the red guy and the blue guy are, as you suggested before, kind of on the same side already? The red guy and the blue guy already basically agree on 9 out of 10 issues. And it just so happens that those are 9 out of 10 issues that you disagree with him on, and most people disagree with him on. I start off the book with a stat. I think they did a study, something like 1,700, almost 2,000 laws, that like policy issues in the US that they looked at over a 5 or 10 year period, and they found a near zero correlation between what the public want and what Congress actually ends up passing as legislation. There is an almost complete disconnect between what the people want and what the leaders end up doing. And this is not new. Democracy has always functioned in this way. It is basically a smokescreen that tells the people that they are sovereign, whereas in fact the real people in power are a near permanent oligarchy who control both sides of this political debate through their various donations and large money super PACs and NGOs and various other philanthropic funds, like the Ford Foundation, people like this. Everybody knows that really that is the true power structure, and what the people want is kind of for the birds. It's just a TV show, as Yarvin put it once.
It's funny because, you talk to a lot of people, just the average person, cranky guy watching the news, and they'll say something like both parties are the same, and they don't actually care about these kind of thing, and they'll just kind of throw it offhand. But then the application of that, the implications of what that means, always seem to escape, even though there's kind of this conventional wisdom to say exactly what you're saying. The way they act and then treat it is not the same. For instance, what really did this for me was immigration, right? I had always, kind of being casually right wing, assumed that, like, sorry, I had always assumed that, well, obviously, like, the Republicans are for, removing illegal immigration and this kind of thing. They just can't get it done. They just can't, whatever. And then the more I looked into the stats and the polling and those kind of things, and obviously polling is, its own problem, but the more I looked into what people actually wanted on immigration, it was very clear that not just the right, but large swaths of the left wanted little to no immigration, and certainly wanted large scale immigration and illegal immigration shut down. And yet still every single year, these elected representatives found ways to not get it done. And so, like you said, it's very clear that what Congress actually prioritizes, what the people who are elected actually prioritize, is far different from what the people that they're supposed to represent want. And I think this leads us into kind of a basic idea. And we can't go through everything. People buy book, obviously. Like, if you want the whole story, go there. But I think it'd be helpful for people who aren't familiar if we broke down to like a few key terms. So could you tell us a little more about the iron law of oligarchy and why it kind of dismantles part of the populist delusion?
Yeah. So the iron law of oligarchy is there's a thinker called Robert Michels who wrote a book called Political Parties. He actually started as a socialist in Germany before World War One. So he was writing he wrote his book in 1911. And he became extremely disillusioned, right? Because the German socialists were meant to be an anti-war party, for one. But when all of a sudden, when the system decided it wanted war, oh, lo and behold, they dropped that principle Like, surprise, surprise. They like everybody else. It's just like the Ukraine war now, right? It's like there's almost no voice in the entire system. It's like, oh, now all of a sudden CNN and Fox and MSNBC, they're lockstep on that issue. You can't separate Nancy Pelosi and Lindsey Graham, right? There is no political spectrum on that. And so what Robert Michels does is that he says, well, we know that there's always this ruling elite, the organized minority and the disorganized majority within a country, within a kind of voting bloc at a state level. You have that. But he says it doesn't just apply at the level of a nation. It applies at every level below that as well. So let's say you have a political party. Let's say you're the Democrats or the Republicans. Well, that neither of those are democratic either. They have a ruling elite and they have a disorganized majority. And the ruling elite, in fact, it was funny. I saw this happen at my church today. Every Sunday, every other Sunday, I take my daughter along. She goes to the little Sunday school there, and I sit through the Church of England service. It just so happens today they were doing they were having their annual meeting. Well, it was one of the funniest things I can remember, because during this meeting, the congregation was meant to vote on all sorts of matters of importance, like the budget, who sits on the council, who are the members of the committee there. All sorts of important matters were voted on, right? And I can't remember how much money this church has, but like the parish has got, I don't know, let's call it £250,000 to be allocated, and all of these different, different policies. Every single vote that took place there was a unanimous vote. Like everybody just put does everybody approve of like John Smith being part of the committee? Hands up. Yeah, okay. I mean, nobody cares. Like nobody knows who anybody is. It was just kind of everything was waved through, because the mass is literally just passive in that way. And it's obvious that even though on paper that congregation is democratic, it's actually those people who are sitting on the committee who will have the final say on how that money is allocated, on what actually gets done. They are the ones who are organized. They are the ones who are actually going to end up doing it, right? And so it is with all organizations from a corporate. I mean, none of these entities, whether it's a chess club or a church group or a political party or they all have this oligarchical pattern where you have a clear set of people who are organized and in control, and a disorganized mass. It's almost like an army battalion. I think Michel says at one point, out on the battlefield, if you just take out the officer, the men who are left without their commanding officers will just they'll devolve into a rabble. They won't know what to do. And we actually saw it in real life. We saw it with January the 6th, for example. Without any real leadership, it was meant to be Donald Trump, right? He just got in a helicopter and ran off, or whatever he did on January the 6th. What were that mass of people? They devolved into a disorganized rabble. Literally, baked Alaska, taking selfies of himself and taking pictures of himself in Nancy Pelosi's office. Imagine Fidel Castro and Che Guevara could have seen that. They'd have been saying, you had many, many, many more times men than we had when we took over Havana. But the difference is that Che Guevara and Fidel Castro were an organized elite vanguard minority interest group, right? Whereas Baked Alaska and his buddies were just the disorganized masses set loose without any leaders. Well, and that's the real difference.
Well, and I think Curtis Yarvin had an excellent point after that event too, to kind of dovetail what you're saying there, because he said even if they had taken the capital, even if they had installed, elected people to be new representatives and started passing bills from the floor of Congress, no one would have taken them seriously, because in the modern age, no one actually believes that like physically sitting in the seat is what makes you the representative. So you can't even have a good old fashioned like takeover. That doesn't even work. So like just the fact that that mass did not understand where power actually resided, they thought power resided in the building. And even when they got into the building, like you said, because without leadership, they didn't know what to do with it, there was never any actual threat. The government for at no moment was actually ever in any kind of danger. The only thing that was happening is these people were creating the kind of political fuel that their enemies could use for years, which has obviously been clear.
Mhm.
What they've been able to do. So it's not. So it not only is it that they don't know how to organize without the leadership, they don't even know where the actual power resides. They don't even know what to actually
Yeah,
pursue.
and Michelle's actually goes into like very specific characteristics that the organized minority require. Okay, so that he actually breaks down 5 factors. 2 of them are psychological, which we don't need to get into, but the other ones are like superior tactical knowledge. Okay, superior technical skills, and here he means skills of communication. Okay, the resources, and resources obviously are important as well, but they're not everything. Like, I mean, you don't have to have. There are examples of vanguard organized elites in history who have actually had a material resource disadvantage, but they've just been superb at these other skills. I mean, a very good example, controversial example, but it's a good example, would be the National Socialists in Germany. Um, whatever you make of him, Joseph Goebbels was a superb communicator. He was all like, they had almost military level organization, and he got his message out there, and he was on the front foot. He was on the narrative front foot with a lot of the events that happened. They were able to have narrative control. Beg Alaska and friends. I'm not picking on just big, you know what I'm talking about. The
I
generally
know
the
what
sixth
you're talking about. Yeah.
problem. I mean, obviously they lost narrative control of that, and it was a gimme to the enemy. It was a gimme to the mainstream media. And I know there was talk about Fed filtration and all that, but let's face it, it was a disaster. It was an absolute disaster from our point of view, and it gave a lot of freebies to the regime. Um, and so it's these sorts of things that actually help to maintain elite control, um, both at the national level, but also at the organizational level. And the reason it's an iron law is that you have all of these you have these 5 different factors, and they all need to be true, right? If you're missing 1 or 2 of them, and they've got all 5, they will maintain control. And once uh, a kind of an oligarchy is in place, it's very, very difficult to dislodge them, and they've got all sorts of tricks. When you're the incumbent, when you hold the levers of power, there's all sorts of cunning things that you can do to make the upstarts seem like crazy. In fact, one of the little things I go into in the book, one of my examples is the squad. You know, like what's her name? The AOC,
AOC, Andrea Ocasio Cortez.
all those 4 women,
Hmm.
um, and as against Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, you know, Dianne Feinstein, Biden, you know, the octogenarian set who've literally been the Democrat Party for the past 50 years. Um, they do a lot of the tricks that Michelle's points out that an incumbent elite will do against a kind of insurgent one. And so far, they have. I mean, AOC is good at getting the cameras on her, but from where I'm sitting, she's just been routinely cucked by Pelosi and friends. Like, she has just been disciplined over and over and over again by the Democratic Party machine. It's actually fascinating to watch if you just sit back a little bit. I haven't really talked about this on my channel, but um, it's just a very neat example of what he talks about of how an old elite are able to just controlled narratives and frames to make the newcomers seem crazy. They're insensible. We're the adults in the room. And they do that a lot, but it's not just an age thing. I mean, we mentioned Tony Blair. Tony Blair did that over and over again in his time in power. He presented himself as the sensible man in the room, as against his enemies who were crazy. And when you looked at it, what did his enemies want to do? They wanted to curb immigration. They actually wanted to do the things that most people wanted. But Blair was able to win 3 elections just by somehow controlling the frame and making his position seem like the sensible one. So, yeah.
Well, and I was just talking to Glenn Greenwald about this, right? Because he was very confused. He was like, I don't understand how this squad. He was a supporter of AOC at the beginning, and her and Bernie are going to change the face of the Democratic Party and turn it into what it's actually supposed to be. And now every one of the squad just voted to send $40 billion to defense contractors, and all these people who got into power talking about dismantling the police are passing bills to put extra emergency funding in the pockets of the Capitol Police and the FBI. And for him, he thinks this is a betrayal. And I'll ask you this to see what you think. But for him, he believes this is a betrayal of their position. And the thing I was trying to explain to Glenn, is look, I understand that you are sincere and there were sincere people on your side, but the people who are going to actually end up in these positions, these positions inside the oligarchy, they were looking to create a situation where they could grasp those levers of power, not smash them. AOC was never going to Congress to get rid of power. She was getting there to take the power for herself.
I mean, this is a very interesting point because Michelle talks about this. He's like, well, basically, if AOC ever had a sincere bone in her body, we will watch her in real time turn into Nancy Pelosi. Right? She will end up becoming, whether she likes it or not, the regime will change her. She won't change the regime. That is the iron law, basically, because in order to get the ring of power, you need to play the game, and the game is, well, you have to become like them. It never works the other way around. And you do actually get those people who stick to their principles. They're very few and far between. Ron Paul is one of them, right? Who else? I mean, Jeremy Corbyn in this country, for all his, he's a far leftist and all the rest of it, but he has been a career, he's rebelled from the backbenches for his whole career. But then what happened, right? What happened when Jeremy Corbyn came within a sniff of number 10, right? The system went crazy. The system, you saw, it doesn't matter that he was Labour. It doesn't matter that he's left wing. The system, for the first time in 100 years, we've got Jews against Jeremy Corbyn on the streets of London, right? Because he's an anti-Semite. I remember, there were media hit pieces rooting out anti-Semitism at the heart of Labour. There were leaks from his communications office. Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell were going on. This is in the middle of an election, okay, where Labour are trying to get elected. The former Prime Minister and his cronies were on television, counter-signaling him, calling him crazy, saying that he needs to be out of the party. And I'm convinced that if Jeremy Corbyn had been elected, that he would have been removed from MI5 or MI6 would have just intervened at that point. I just do not think they would have allowed him in power. That was a little bit crazy what happened there. And it's actually ironically because the people in control of Labour actually allowed a little bit of democracy in Labour. They actually lost the permanent oligarchy within Labour. I think it was Ed Miliband loosened the rules around voting, and all of a sudden, Corbyn managed to find himself at the head of the party. The system dealt with that pretty swiftly.
Well,
Yeah. So
There's actually been an amazing example in the US recently with Madison Cawthorn. I don't know if you know anything about this, but he's the very young representative who's a disabled guy. He's in a wheelchair.
mhm.
And he he's been very much of this MAGA, populist right energy came in on that wave. And he let slip that a bunch of Republicans in DC were basically like inviting him to a bunch of eyes wide shut cocaine parties.
Right. Yeah.
And when he did that, magically, as if out of nowhere, like 3 congressional investigations were launched about like his fundraising. The photos suddenly surfaced of him in lingerie. Like there were like 9 different scandals that hit him
Mhm.
simultaneously the minute he said this at all.
Mhm.
It's almost embarrassing how obvious the hit on him was. And I have no love in particular for Madison Cawthorn. Like I don't think he's, particularly relevant, but it's just amazing. If AOC will play the game, so she'll integrate, right? She'll make the noises she needs to, but in the end she's going to go and she's going to become the new Nancy Pelosi, like you're saying.
Mhm.
Cawthorn shows that maybe he won't play ball, and he's destroyed in like 18 different
Yeah.
ways
I mean, he's going to
simultaneously.
be gutted like a pig, and I'm afraid,
Yeah.
just like in the end, Corbyn was. Because, and if we're just going to be completely cold-blooded about this analysis, not taking any sides, not wondering, um, it's literally they have superior organization, they've got superior communication, they control the frame, um, they want to maintain power, they see a threat to their power, and you know, there it is, and I don't think anybody. It's not even conspiratorial to say you can have such a thing as a coordinated hit job on somebody because they make it obvious. It just all happens at once. I mean, it's like you say, Aaron, it's embarrassing how obvious it is sometimes. But there we are.
So we have this iron law of oligarchy, and like I said, you got the whole book about this. We could go into a bunch of different aspects of this. We've both read significant amounts on elite theorists. Maybe that's a good thing to do before we move on.
Mhm.
Is can you just lay out the basics of maybe what elite theory is? Because a lot of people have started to notice neo-reactionary thought. Like very
Mhm.
mainstream people are discussing it now, obviously, like it's
Yeah.
in Vanity Fair, that kind of thing. You yourself never claimed this title, understandably so. I'm hesitant to use it at the moment just because I don't think it means for people what it I always thought it was better understood as a school political analysis rather than some kind of ideology, and now it's
Yeah.
being used as an ideology and a rallying point. So I just kind of shy away from that. But whether you want to call it neo-reactionary thinking or you want to call it the Italian elite school, more and
Mhm.
more people are looking at this and seeing it as a valuable way to understand what's going on. But I have also seen a lot of people, some very mainstream people, say things like the problem with this is it's not a real tradition. It's not a real tradition of philosophical thought. It's not. It doesn't have a true roots and understanding and that kind of thing. And I think what's interesting is that you yourself, Yarvin, and many others, while you're not a neo-reactionary, while you didn't follow Yarvin to this conclusion necessarily,
Mhm.
so many people seem to have not only pulled the people who are directly in Italian elite theory, but also people like Bertrand de Juvenal and Carl Schmitt and these kind of people.
Mhm.
They've pulled them in this way to kind of form a different school. And so,
Mhm.
what would you say is the roots of this? How is it growing? Is there is the when people say that it's not complete because it doesn't have this tradition, is that a valid criticism? What
Mhm.
would you say about this
Yeah.
kind of
So
school of
I mean,
thought?
those people who are saying it's not a valid tradition haven't done their homework, frankly. It is a valid tradition. Moscow wrote The Ruling Class in 1895. Um, Pareto, uh, uh, his Mind and Society came out in 1935, but is that he wrote it a lot earlier. It came out in 1906, I think it is. And Michelle's book we were just talking about came out in 1911, and they were grouped together as the Italian elite theorists. And there was a lot of buzz and excitement around them in the 1920s and the 1930s. Okay, this was at a time when I think it's easy to forget how much the Second World War changed the kind of intellectual climate in Europe and in America. Because a lot of one of the things that I found really striking when I was researching this book is the extent to which the intelligentsia, both in Europe and in New York, and in Washington, were kind of enamored with this thought in the 20s and the 30s also. I'm talking about guys like, not even guys on the right, guys like Walter Lippmann was an avowed elitist. Mencken was an elitist, right? These are the kind of intellectuals of that, the public intellectuals of that era. Edward Bernays is another one who was an avowed elitist, right? So, and this is basically this idea that, you know, in reality, power is always this organized minority, and democracy is a sham. Basically, it's an illusion. And I mean, I guess that goes two ways. Like somebody like Lippmann, he was like, yeah, and that's a good thing. That it's actually a good thing that you have elites in charge, because you don't want people like, because they've got expertise, right? So you can actually see how this can not morph. It can turn into sorry.
Good save.
It can transform into the kind of technocracy that we have witnessed, the rule by expert, right? One of the famous things that Michael Gove said during Brexit is that the public have had enough of experts, okay? And then we had the pandemic and Fauci and, you know, explicit rule by scientists now, right? But how can I put this? So you can see how the managerialism that James Burnham, who's another thinker I talk about there, actually goes hand in hand with the elitist doctrine. And one of the things I found, and this would be if I sat down with somebody like Claire Lehman, I've actually seen a lot of really embarrassing tweets and things from people like Lehman, who've said things like, "Oh, this is just like warmed up Marxism." It isn't. It's explicitly an anti-Marxist alternative power analysis. The Marxists hated it because, you know, in Marxism, it's all about, well, who owns the property, right? Who owns the means of production? It's about class warfare. Whereas this is actually, well, no, it's not about who owns what. It is about who has functional control. Who is this organized minority? And as the 20th century develops, you know, it becomes this managerial elite. This is the managerial revolution that Burnham talked about. What I found really interesting, Auron, and this is quite hidden, but you know, I researched this book pretty deeply, is that this thinking, this elite thinking, this Mosca, Pareto, Michelle's, even though a lot of mainstream Marxists and things disavowed it, was pretty mainstream. It was mainstream in Washington think tank world in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Okay, I found all sorts of elite. I found a pamphlet. I've got it here somewhere. You know, written by the Hoover Institute, doing an elite analysis of the USA and of the Soviet Union. In fact, it was claiming that they'd identified a circulation of elites within the Soviet Union, that it had gone from Lenin's foxes to Stalin's lions, but basically. And then, I mean, there are a few other thinkers I haven't mentioned, like C. Wright Mill and people like that. But basically, by the 1980s and 1990s, this elitist thinking was actually right there in the core of Harvard, Yale, you know, our ruling class. Actually, it internalized a lot of this stuff and taken it for granted that the great unwashed shouldn't have their say on things. So in a strange way, they, in a strange way, as is so often the case, the right is getting their second. One of the most surprising things I found in my research is Carl Schmitt, who was, let's not forget, a card-carrying Nazi at one point. Okay, I'm not going to say he was responsible for legitimizing Hitler and all of that sort of stuff, but he, I was very surprised to find that, like Heidegger, he has been like almost entirely rehabilitated by the Western Academy, by the US Academy in particular. And who got there first? Oh, what a surprise! It was neocons, it was certain neoliberal elites, it was Harvard, it was Yale. They got there, like they were right in there in the 1970s and 80s and 90s. So all of these teachings that I'm going through in this book are kind of right at the heart of regime thought. Now that sounds very unlikely, doesn't it? But it's not. And you can follow my footnotes if you don't believe me. There's tons of stuff written on these guys. So it's not like I am unearthing some kind of great lost, there's tons of secondary material on these guys. There has been some there's some very strange, how can I put it, so there's this tradition in the kind of Western universities to claim the mantle of elitism, but like for democracy. It sounds bizarre, right? But it's basically just a Schmittian reframing. Whatever the regime wants, that's democracy, right? And you actually see them use these tricks in real time. And once you've read all of these thinkers, it becomes so blatant that I find myself laughing on a daily basis. You can actually see it in real time. Like when Viktor Orban wins an election, that's a threat to democracy. But when friends of ours, do things, that's liberal democracy. It's just like. Anyway, carry on, Auron. Sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, yeah, I've been in situations many times where I'm on Twitter and we'll make a prediction on what the headline is going to be tomorrow, or here's the pattern you're going to see the media follow for the next couple of days, and people are like, oh, how did I'll post the prediction and the pictures backing it up, like a week later, and people are like, how do you do that? Like, guys, it's like there's no special ability here. I can't see the future. We just literally have the playbook. They've laid it out. You can predict accurately by simply looking at what they've said they're going to do. Because I think you're right that I feel like there's this front of the house ideology and then the back of the house ideology, right? Like if you're learning political theory or something in college, they'll teach you, John Rawls or something, right? But the back of the house is all operating on Carl Schmitt, right? Like they know what actually works. And so you'll get a very different dynamic. And when you go back and you excavate these thinkers like you're talking about, you can start predicting the future, not because you have some kind of magical ability, but you're simply just looking at the stuff that they actually believe and how they actually operate.
There is a strange avenue as well through which the Italian elitists reach the left, and they do it through Antonio Gramsci. If you've ever read him, if you read the Prison Notebooks, he critiques Mosca quite a bit in there. And if you remember, a whole section of Gramsci is called The New Prince. So Gramsci is consciously writing in the tradition of Machiavelli, as these other guys are. And of course, Gramsci was Italian. Well, the thing is that if you read the literature, all the titles are things like, Beyond the Right and Left. I've got a book here called Beyond the Right and Left, Mosca and Gramsci. Okay. This is a left-wing study with Mosca as a part of it, if that makes any sense. So elite theory does reach and is kind of infused in the teachings of left-wing establishment too, and it gets maybe they get it secondhand through Gramsci. Althusser has a book called Machiavelli and Us as well, which discusses some of the elitists. So yeah, some of this thought is more mainstream than than may meet the eye. But like you say, it's back of the house. They're not, it's not the stuff you'll learn in political science 101 in university. You might do a postgraduate seminar on it though, or something like that, maybe.
No, exactly. So I don't want to rehash the whole book, of course. Again, buy book, people. The link is down there. But one thing I want to address, which is a constant criticism, and one that I have, even though I agree with and understand these concepts. One problem I have, and one that gets leveled at people like yourself and myself often, which I think is valid, is any system, the vast majority of the time when you have a system that is being properly understood and analyzed and described, it can lock you in to that system, right? You look at it and you
Mhm.
say, this is insurmountable, right? Like, you have to have
Mhm.
the elites, the iron law of oligarchy. There is no escape. They control everything. Their control is perfect. There's no way to break through. They have all the exits and the entry points under control.
Mm.
And so the concern becomes, what do you do if you can't be populist? If
Mhm.
populism, the democratic process, the mass politics is a lie, if it's all just a game to keep us from doing anything effective, is there anything that can be changed? Maybe not at the person of the individual, maybe we're just saying like the average
Mhm.
person's just not going to have an effect on this. But even at the elite level, is there an escape? Is there a way that we can
Yep.
see this change?
Yeah. So when we say that all change is top down, um, I do make a distinction. There's two. I guess there is change that the elites want, that they dress up as having popular support. The civil rights movement is a very good example, right? But the more prescient example in everybody's minds, I guess, would be for Greta Thunberg, right? I mean, is there a single person listening to the show who believes that Greta Thunberg was the product of an organic grassroots movement? This organic grassroots movement was just, gets an audience with the Pope and with high representatives of the UN and the British government whenever she wants, and the front page of every newspaper at the click of a finger. It's obvious that Greta Thunberg was astroturfed, okay? And when it comes to stuff that the regime wants, it's Greta Thunberg's all the way down. Okay. It's always, there is elite organization behind a figure like a Greta Thunberg. There's money. There are, I mean, I've got a book here called The Transgender Industrial Complex, which lists hundreds of organizations that have donated billions of dollars to LGBTQ plus rights since the 1960s, right? That is not like they paint it as a kind of people's thing, but it's actually got massive backing. BLM, do you remember? Every corporation overnight was supporting them. You know, it's obvious when something has the regime behind it. Okay. But you can have a different type of change, which is what you could broadly describe as revolutionary change. Okay. Now, that revolution could be a violent revolution like Iran in 1979 or the Russian Revolution, or it could be a kind of soft revolution. I guess the managerial revolution would be an example of a soft one, um, or the ones that Yarvin has identified. I can't remember the essay. What do you call it? Like FDR
Yeah, yeah.
was a clear, or the Christopher Caldwell book, where he
Agent
talks about,
entitlement.
yeah, where he talks about um, the post civil rights regime basically rewrote the entire constitution, and that's clearly a different situation to any previous iteration of America. You basically had some sort of revolution there. There are ethnic components to that as well. And people have written books about this too. You just have to look at the composition of the Supreme Court. Okay, all of a sudden, WASPs kind of start losing power and influence, and you get this um, alliance of the kind of immigrants, if you want. I'm talking about Jews who arrived from Eastern Europe and Russia. I'm talking about Italian and Irish Catholics who worked in coalition. And there's very clearly a moment in the 1960s that coincides with JFK and the civil rights stuff, where this group come into prominence. So you could say that America experienced internally a circulation of elites, because clearly the old WASPs were on the outs, right? And now, I mean, you don't see these guys. I mean, look at the Supreme Court. It's either they're either Catholics or they're or they're from the liberal coalition, essentially. So you can have internal one. You can have a kind of soft revolution or a hard revolution, if you want to put it that way. And that those revolutions are not bottom up. They require concerted, organized effort. Okay. Now, whatever you make of the Federalist Society and of what's her name on the Supreme Court, Barrett Cohen,
Amy Coney Barrett,
right? Like and Kavanaugh and these guys aren't the product of just like Donald Trump clicking his fingers. There's decades, like millions of dollars, organization, elite backing, effort has gone into those Supreme Court justices sitting there, right? And that's the culmination of decades and decades long project, and you can look into the history of that. And that's an example of elite organization on the right, believe it or not, or of a certain type of right within the establishment, right, I guess. So the thing that you can do is that you can get organized. The regime, of course, makes that difficult for us because the right wing is kind of banned right. in our system, but that still doesn't mean that we can't start getting into this mindset and start thinking about ways that we can get organized, because organization is political power. And you even see it in small ways, like as soon as parents started getting organized on those committees in America, did you see how the regime rankled?
Yeah, FBI was starting to threaten random moms at school boards.
Right, but organization is power. And if the regime can be forced into using force, because they're a soft managerial, foxy regime, right, who have managed to get everything so far based on their skills of persuasion and manipulation of people's kind of mindsets and things like that. Well, it's obvious that their powers of persuasion have rapidly been slipping, and eventually, when the regime gets brittle enough, it will be forced to either they'll either have to use force, okay, or they will have to have a little mini circulation themselves to let more kind of lions come into power and to become more openly coercive, a coercive regime, right? But in a strange way, even if they're a hostile coercive regime, it can be better to have, like, at least there's a boot, at least you can identify that boot on your head and everybody can see it, right? The trouble with our current elites is that they're so difficult to pin down. They're so insidious. When you start talking about them, it's not difficult for them to start painting you as sounding like a nutter. Oh, you're Alex Jones, or you're talking about some cabal in a smoky room or whatever. And they're very good at leveraging all of these ready-made memes in which to paint you as a lunatic and themselves as the sensible person in the room, which is their go-to ploy. But essentially, yes, the whole book is saying if you want to make change, you have to get organized, and that means getting serious organization, not jumping up and down with placards, going to mass rallies, like all of that stuff. It may be good for morale, it may make you feel good, but it doesn't change a damn thing. I mean, organization is the only thing that's ever changed anything in politics. Yep.
Absolutely. Well, I don't want to keep you here forever, so we could start working our way through some of the super chats. Was there anything about the book or any topic that we didn't get to that you wanted to talk about before we hit the super chats?
Well, I mean, I guess we didn't get to the final part of the book is about ideology and media control. We didn't really talk about that as much, but obviously it's very, very important for our specific regime. Like when we're looking at the current elites, they're very much like a kind of media-led, a media-led way of governing. I guess they're managers in persuasion first and foremost. And I think that's when you think about how they deal with any issue, it's actually a weakness of theirs. They don't like things becoming real or kinetic. They actually freaked out a little bit about January the 6th. Beneath all of the framing and the perception management that they did, the fact that it was kinetic freaked them out a little bit. Even when something is real, it's still a perception management game for them. Like the Ukraine war, for example, has been two different wars in a way. There's the real war on the ground, which involves people getting killed and real missiles and Russian people and Ukrainians dying. And then there's been the media war, which involves, well, I mean, I don't want to retread it all, but it's just a classic example of them. I mean, there's a very good film I'd encourage people to go back and watch. Is that film Wag the Dog from
it's
the
a great
90s?
movie.
Did you ever see that? I'm
Yeah.
surprised they made it. I'm surprised they actually made it, because they have this habit of wanting to. I don't know why the regime does this, but they like to show you behind. It's like the Wizard of Oz continually pulls back the curtain and shows like all of the. I've often wondered if the regime has a kind of Riddler from Batman like compulsion to show you what they're doing, because they always signal what they're up to. Like they always just call the play before it happened. They even did it with the bloody election.
Yes,
I remember watching the BBC, and the BBC saying, "Oh, listen, what's going to happen is in the middle of the night the vote's going to change and Donald Trump's going to claim a victory." I mean, like, and they called the play before it happened. How did the BBC know that?
I really think it's that the people running the machine are children comparatively, cognitively, and like discipline wise. Like just the elite has degenerated to the point where they feel so safe and they feel so secure and they can't imagine a world where they aren't in control, that they see no problem with pulling back the curtain a little bit so they can take a victory lap and a bow. I mean, you remember they had the Time magazine article after the fact, right? Like these people literally took a victory lap and said, we altered the election. What are you going to do about it? Right. So I think any previous iteration of the regime would have had the self-control to keep that knowledge hidden. But the ones we have now, they're the spoiled trust fund children who wrap their brand new sports car around the tree and just assume they're going to get another one forever, right?
Yeah, I often joked if Edward Bernays, who I just mentioned, could come back now, he'd probably have a stroke. He'd probably just be like, "What?"
He'd thrash them with a cane. Yeah, he'd take them to the woodshed. Yeah, how could you take this beautiful thing that we crafted for you and just treat it this way? Yeah, 100%. All right, well, let's go ahead and take a look. Once again, guys, you should be checking out the link and finding AA's book here to get more. We only hit the very barest points here to just give you a taste. You should be getting the book so you can go deeper and find all that information, learn about all the things we didn't touch on here. But let's go ahead and get started. Cameron T for $2 says, now this is show business. Good work, lads. Well, thank you very much. Yep, we're trying to do our best here. Hopefully that one was pretty interesting. I thought it was very, very interesting introduction here. And then we have Monothalamus, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, says BAP has BAM as the centerpiece of his work. What shall one day be remembered as the masterpiece of Auron MacIntyre and the academic agent? Well, obviously we'll have the Populist Delusion here, and a key building block. And yeah, hopefully one day I'm going to have a tome out, but that's still much work to get that done. I need to just sit down and make it happen. But
I'm actually planning I have planned a trilogy, Auron,
Oh, excellent.
I always knew I was going to write these 3 books like almost concurrently. The next one is called The Prophets of Doom. It's already been um, contracted. And in fact, I ended up bringing out Populist Delusion with Imperium Press, who've been fantastic, by the way, because this other press that this other book is coming. I was like, oh, I finished the the second book first. Can we bring that out first? And they were like, no. I was like, okay, I'll just bring out this with another press, and let's just leave it as things are. So yeah, that one should be out, sometime early next year. So it's going to be The Populist Delusion out now, Prophets of Doom coming soon, and then after that, I want to write the Boomer Truth Regime, and I think ultimately, I'm hoping that the Boomer Truth Regime will be my will be
The magnum opus there.
the cherry on top
Yeah.
of the cake. Hopefully, yeah, because ultimately, what I really wanted to break down in this book was the central lie of the Boomer Truth Regime, which is this idea of bottom up. Everything's bottom up, right? But actually, it's top down. Culture is downstream of law. You know, it is the leaders who set the tempo of any society, of any culture. Um, so I mean, there's many other myths that I try to bust in the book as well. Like, for example, liberalism's attempt to escape from politics. I mean, liberalism is basically a desire to escape from politics,
Mhm.
and there's just no way you cannot escape politics. Like, you may want to escape politics, but politics, will be interested in you. Put it that way. So, I mean, so that's that. In this next book, in The Prophets of Doom, I want to attack the notion of progressive history, or it's going to be a book really about cyclical history and about notions of progress, and why capital P progress is such a kind of thought terminating cliche way of thinking about things, and how if we're ever going to free ourselves of Cthulhu swimming left, we have to destroy the notion of progress, period. And then the Boomer Truth regime will finish the job. Whatever's left over, I'll take a crowbar to it. And
Very nice.
yeah.
No, glad to hear you'll be launching your attack on Whig history. So guys, make sure you're leaving plenty of space in the bookshelf so you can collect the box set here. Let's see. Son of a glitch for $10. Thank you very much, sir. Just bought AA's book, so here's some dosh for you, Aaron MacIntyre. Only question I have is something I've wondered for a minute. Is Auron a username because you're a FF10 fan? Yeah, I wanted something I could write under, and I literally just looked at my bookshelf, and there was a strategy guide for Final Fantasy X and Alistair MacIntyre's After Virtue, and that is how my moniker was born, as nerdy as that is. Let's see. Falling outside the normal moral constraints for $2. Thanks for hosting my favorite Morrowind villain. Are you a Morrowind villain? Do I not know? Do I not know this
I
reference?
don't know. I think Sargon may have said that once, but
Okay. I mean, I could see it. I'm not discounting it. I just wasn't sure here. Let's see. Sorry, I lost a few super chats, I think. Trying to find. I don't know why I'm always so terrible at this.
there's a secret button on YouTube that I use, which
Oh,
just
okay.
collects them all. If you go on, sorry to do this. If you go on YouTube Studio and click on monetization tab and then supers, it just brings up all the super chats there.
Okay. I should be doing it that way. I was just trying to keep track through StreamYard, and it's easy to lose them there. All right, so Cringe Walker, thank you, sir. The latest scholarship by Sheikh Parvini Al, however that's best pronounced, threw a mighty shoe at the face of the great Satan in Sahala. All right. What else we got here? All right, Nathan Hood for £5. Thank you. Democracy don't rule the world. You better get that in your head. The world is ruled by violence, but I guess that's better left unsaid. The wise sage Bob Dylan. We both share a love for Bob Dylan.
Yes, and there is a hidden Bob Dylan quote in the book. If you
is there? I didn't immediately notice. Okay, I'll have to.
Yeah, I think it's sometimes Satan comes as a man of peace.
Yeah. Okay. No, I do love myself some Bob Dylan. Blood on the Tracks remains one of my favorite things. Let's see what else we got here. Sorry, so much chat to go through. All right, we've got Quartz ZZ7 for $10 Canadian. Thank you very much. Elite theory is so esoteric and complex. It takes two crazy thesis to prove. One, the more organized group wins. Two, large groups are hard to organize. How could you ever begin to understand this? Yeah, I get. Yeah, it's not. I know none of this sounds particularly difficult, and I guess here's the thing: is you literally have to live through hundreds of years of liberal indoctrination. Like you have to be standing. Fish don't have a theory of water, right? Is the quote, right? And you just have to have been grown up and been indoctrinated in this literally since the day you were born to kind of believe that like there isn't a ruling class and the people rule, and like I know all this stuff sounds super obvious once you get into it, but it's not. And not only is it not, but when you talk to like very mainstream, very well-known, political commentators, they don't talk about this stuff either. Like it's very weird. Like I know you think that like all the people in positions of power and all the people who have like big shows and big jobs, doing political commentary, you think they all know this stuff. You think this is all very basic to them. It is not. It's not. Like I know that's hard to believe, but trust me, it is not. So yeah, as obvious as a lot of this stuff can seem, not so much.
It's kind of ironic because Moscow and Pareto hated each other, and it's because Moscow wanted credit for elite theory because he brought out his book first, and Pareto's like, what you said is just obvious. Everybody's known that forever, so I'm not giving you any credit. Like he was like, well, why aren't you footnoting me more? And Pareto just wouldn't credit him. He was just like, yeah, people have known that since Plato, dude. What you on about? So it was kind of, it's just kind of one of those funny kind of academic fisticuff things, which I came across in the mid. And then weirdly, Michelle's, he kind of knew them both, and he was just kind of like diplomatically trying to like stay in with both of them, and he managed to do it. So clearly a skilled Machiavellian.
Well, it just really is. Like I'm in these conversations with people, and I just I feel like I have to repeat every 5 minutes. Like societies are always run by organized minorities. Societies are always run by organized more. Like it seems obvious. It seems clear. It seems very straightforward, and then you get 5 minutes into any political conversation, even with very high level, popular, famous people, and they start talking about, well, the majority of people don't believe that. It's like that's immaterial to the point. Like that's
what you think doesn't matter.
Yeah,
doesn't matter at all.
Very, very much so. All right, well, thank you. Let's go to our next one here. Scratchy McDump Waffle, impressive name. Thank you for $10. The elites may be in power, but they aren't necessarily in control. You can't think that they have control over everything and simultaneously believe they're incompetent. So there's a lot of mistakes, I think, in this statement.
Yeah, there is.
Yeah, not to. I appreciate your donation. Not to dump on you, Dump Waffle.
Well, I mean, the elite theory does not say that elites are all powerful. It says that this is the way a culture functions. Okay. It doesn't say that they get everything right, or that they can't be unseated, or that they can't be outmaneuvered by a counter elite. So it's not actually as blackpilling as it makes. Like all you need is superior organization to them. and enough will, and you will be able to dislodge them eventually. But the fact of the matter is that that's not happening at the moment. Um, there are signs that it is. I mean, the thing is, it is happening to an extent in America, but the quality of that counter elite is something I worry about. If I'm honest with you, Auron. I'm thinking of like Marjorie Taylor Greene and the real head banging populist figureheads over there. I mean, they should be the counter elite, but it's like, is Marjorie Taylor Greene going to turn off a lot of people? I don't know. I mean, is she going to be the one who's going to unseat one of the most powerful regimes of all time?
So
Something makes me wonder how organized that Trumpian kind of coalition is.
yeah, and this is a real problem, but I think there's also a mistake made by people who point that out, though you're right to point it out. So it's 100% true that like people like Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene, they are not the people you think would lead a counter elite, and they probably won't, right? That's not where we are, I think, in the cycle of this thing. I think the really there are very, very basic problems with kind of people understanding what's going on. That's why we have to say such obvious things so often, because there's a deep, deep misunderstanding about how power works, how politics works, how public opinion is controlled, and it's a misunderstanding at very high levels on what passes for the right in America. And so it takes crazy people. It takes people who do not fit into the mold, who would not go into the elite, who do not blend well into high society, to be willing to say things other people won't. And even though Donald Trump will never be confused with someone who does commentary on literary classics, and Marjorie Taylor Greene will never give you a deep introspective thought-provoking analysis of Pareto, they do serve a function of saying something that makes people who should be talking about that stuff think, right? And so
I also think that Green and Trump and who's that other one, Matt Gaetz and various others, they've shown a very central Schmittian point. Carl, I think it's Schmitt who talks about this more than anyone else. There's no such thing as the neutral institution.
Yeah.
In theory, the institutions are meant to be neutral. In practice, the institutions favor power, right? They favor the regime, and they're for the friends of the regime, and they're against the enemies of the regime. And I think that the easiest way to look at this is, well, how did the Supreme Court turn around and say the entire state of Texas and 20 other states have no standing whatsoever?
Yeah.
The sitting president of the United States, the entire, like, none of these people they don't have we're not going to hear any of these cases whatsoever. And yet the same regime spent the last 3 years investigating every nook and cranny of Donald Trump's life, under the pretext that he was a Russian agent or some bullshit. The whole Russia Gate thing. I mean, the FBI were involved, multiple courts were involved. And this guy, this John Durham character, this special counsel, is turning up he's turning up quite a lot of stuff in that whole investigation. Obviously, it's being ignored by the media. Obviously, nobody cares anymore because it's ancient history now. The news cycle's moved on. But for those people paying attention, my hope is that it's destroyed trust in those institutions. It's shown them for what they are. And my worry is, Auron, if I'm honest, and I told Paul Gottfried this as well, is that the regime is actually, it may pull a very clever containment maneuver whereby it wins back trust from some of our guys by giving them a few kind of hollow victories, like DeSantis's Woke Act, or Disney, or Roe v. Wade, or something like this, like the abortion issue. like I see a day, like let's say the Supreme Court does overturn Roe v. Wade. Does that mean all of those boomers, all of those people watching this stream that had actually lost faith in the institutions, now all those people are won back again? I'll just tell you, one of the things that's horrified me is to see the same people who were backing the truckers in Canada, then all of a sudden wave the Ukraine flag like 3 weeks later. Same people. That shouldn't be happening, and yet it is. And I fear the containment game of the regime may be coming on strong soon. But anyway.
No, I think you're right about that. I think a lot of people, this is Yarvin's argument again, right? He said, he was directly critical of things like Rufo's victories on CRT and that kind of thing, because he said, they give energy to the regime, they give it the enemy it's looking for, they can sell this to their supporters, even though it was dead. It kind of pumps blood back into these people. And because the victories aren't total, because the victories don't actually root out the core problems, handing over small victories can grant the regime continued legitimacy.
I did a Substack post a while back on the Stop Woke Act, which everybody was raving about. Do you remember?
Yeah.
If you read that Stop Woke Act, I tell you, if Stalin was to read that, it was more. It's like that Stop Woke Act is more to the left than Joseph Stalin was. It's an insanely politically correct piece of work.
Yep.
That basically outlaws any form of in-group preference whatsoever in the state of Florida. I mean, it is basically, we had Gordon Brown in this country passed something called the Equalities Act 2010, which is actually the source of a lot of kind of social justice. The culture is downstream from law, right? A lot of the stuff that we've seen in this country is downstream of that 2010 Equalities Act. If you read that Stop Woke Act, it is basically a word-for-word rewrite of that Equalities Act that we had here, under the guise of a right-wing victory. So just keep an eye on stuff like that.
Well, that's the problem, right? Is the right thinks it's outflanking the left by crafting a piece of legislation so careful that it doesn't cross any lines, and by doing so, they've simply enshrined the victories of the left by themselves passing a piece of legislation that basically acknowledges and accepts all of the premises that came before it, which is a very common thing that they do.
Yeah, I think, by the way, I was thinking, like, what is it that really sets the dissident right apart from the establishment right? And I think the thing is, for us, we don't see any of the left-wing victories of the past as permanent, right? None of them at all.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's back on the table. When I say everything, I mean everything, like women's votes or whatever. Like, and I'm not saying that either you or I are necessarily against women voting. I'm against everybody voting, incidentally.
Yeah. So I was gonna say, but I'm looking for a wholesale repeal of that franchise.
But you understand what I'm saying, right?
Yeah.
We don't see any of their victories as lasting or necessary. We see them for what they are. Whereas the establishment right has got this habit of kind of rubber stamp. I mean, Pareto talks about it. The class twos rubber stamping the gains of the class ones. That's all they ever do. Just 10 years behind. And we don't want to be those. We don't want to be that type of right wing. So it's probably, yeah. I mean, that's what distinguishes us more than anything else. Yeah.
Absolutely. Sorry, Noka Republican missed yours, but I went back and found it. It says Fidel Castro experienced a January 6th equivalent while in Bogota, Colombia in April 9th, 1948. His take was that the people got drunk and the opportunity was lost. I'm not super familiar with that history. Do you know the reference he's talking about there, AA?
No, I don't. I'd be interested to look into that. Sounds really funny. I mean, I kind of like, I do think young Fidel Castro was kind of a Chad. He looked like Liam Neeson. If you ever look at Liam Neeson and Fidel Castro together. Young Liam Neeson, young Fidel Castro. So
I mean, having fathered
having
the
fathered
Prime
Justin
Minister of
Trudeau,
Canada,
obviously,
yeah,
yeah.
right. Let's see. Ganage Blob Flankus. Sorry, I'm terrible at pronouncing these things. Thank you for your donation. They say what they will do to make you accomplices. Okay, I see what you're saying there. They call their shot so that you will become an accomplice in some way. I mean, there might be some truth to that. I mean, they're also setting frame by doing that, right? So that's an issue as well, by announcing their plans in advance.
I mean, they're very good at doing something that Trump did as well, which is massively overshooting what they want. I can't remember what the exact name for it now is. Is like you go for something that seems so insane that nobody would agree to it, but by setting the pitch all the way over there,
Anchoring, yeah.
you anchor. Yeah, I mean, Trump was a master at it. He'd be like, "Oh, build a wall." Well, he's not going to build a bloody wall. That's insane. But now the whole idea of reducing immigration was kind of like firmly in the Overton window.
Yeah.
And now we're at the point where I don't know if you've noticed this, Auron, as a keen observer of the media, but it feels like the media are struggling to put
Replacement theory, right?
the replacement theory
Yep.
back in the bottle. I don't know what they call it, the celebration parallax or whatever,
Yep.
but it's like they've done all their usual tricks and they just haven't worked. I always find it really funny when that happens.
This is a real problem for them. Like, this is a real problem. I did a tweet thread on this, because they Tucker Carlson has been bringing it up, and of course you're not allowed to talk about this, and they've wanted to move in on him, and so they thought they had him back against the wall when this tragedy occurred at the supermarket, because this insane person mentioned the something akin to this at some point. And the problem is, the more they try to explain why it's crazy, the more they end up confirming pretty much everything that Tucker Carlson has been saying. So much so that then it becomes clear that they've, very obvious that they've been talking about this for decades and celebrating it openly on a regular basis. It's you can Google search and read, dozens of pages of just, Democrats and left wingers and journalists, writing victorious articles on exactly this subject. And so, that one has gotten wildly out of containment for them, which, though, and this is always the thing, right? This is the up and the downside. The downside for them is obviously, like, this is out in the wild. The upside for them is enough people are saying it now that they can pretend that the other side all is conspiracy crazy supremacists or something. And so they'll use this as like, look what the right is talking about with their base, right? So this will justify with their base and fire things up, and this will give them the what they need to, like, reach for more power and enact more government programs and oversight bureaus and stuff. But it also, once again reveals kind of their soft power falls apart in this area.
Yeah, and it also pushed that shooting that happened off the front page. Like, they had to drop it.
Yep, absolutely.
Faster than Christine Blasey Ford.
All right, let's see. Nathan J. Hood, thank you for your donation. Thoughts on Eric Hoffer's True Believer? I've heard of it, but I'm not familiar. Do you know anything about that one?
No, I am also. I've heard the name, but I haven't read it. That's something about, like, a kind of like a partisan, like a true believer in a cult or something.
No,
If I correct, I think Eric Hoffer wrote about cults, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that sounds right. Again, yeah, sorry guys. I know there are like a million books you're supposed to read, and I do my best, but, like, I just don't have the encyclopedic. I'm not Curtis Yarvin. I haven't actually read everything. Let's see. Nathan Hood again. Thank you. Who in the book talks about therapeutic state? You were talking about Gottfried, right? That was your reference point for the therapeutic state.
Yes, Paul Gottfried, and specifically, he's got two books actually. One's called After Liberalism, and the other one is called Multiculturalism and the Politics of Guilt. I tell you something. I tell you one thing I should have said earlier on, Auron. I'll say it now. If there's two guys who got what was happening light years before anybody else, it was Samuel T. Francis and Paul Gottfried.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
mean, they got this in the early 90s. They knew what was happening. They were saying it then, and nobody was listening to them back then.
Well, they actively ran them out of polite company for saying it. It wasn't just that people weren't listening; they were silenced aggressively.
Yeah, and then I tell you what, Dinesh D'Souza is an absolute scumbag
Oh yeah.
because he basically did a cancellation on Sam Francis in 90. Got him fired from his weekly column in 1995. Called him a racist and all the rest of it. One absolute scumbag. I don't know what Dinesh D'Souza is doing now, but he should have that on his conscious for the rest of his life, I would say.
Well, he's doing controlled opposition, right? He just did the video. I think he did the documentary about the votes and that kind of thing. And so that they're trying to take their place. The neocons are trying to take their place inside the MAGA movement, but no one should forget what the assassination that occurred to the basically on these people who were right from the beginning. Same thing with Pat Buchanan, right? Like these people, everything Donald Trump was talking about that people love, Pat Buchanan was talking about, right? He said it decades ago.
And in my own small way, one of the things I wanted to do was just show how the paleocons, specifically Francis and Gottfried, but also the wider milieu from which they came, including Buchanan, intellectually were light years ahead of the neocons, right? It's an absolute tragedy that someone like Jonah Goldberg still has like a widely syndicated column, whereas Gottfried is just like, I mean, he's still doing chronicles and so on, but if there was any justice, Francis and Gottfried would have been front and center, not pushed off to the side and like disavowed. Yet the likes of D'Souza and Goldberg and all these clowns have like long-lasting careers and pension funds and all the rest of it. So I do think that's one of the great tragedies, and that's on the Buckleyites, to be honest, which I have discovered they write about at length, the paleocons, because they've always been kept out. The Misesians were kept out, Rothbard was kept out, Buchanan was kept out.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can only hope. I mean, because it could be clear, it is a tragedy, but not like an accident, right? Like this was manufactured, and there's a reason that all useful, thoughtful opposition was cut off from the mainstream. And so hopefully one of the things that YouTube and these other avenues let us do is make an end run around kind of this control and bring these ideas back into the forefront.
I just want to say Jonah Goldberg wrote two of the worst books of all time. Yeah. One is called Liberal Fascism, and the other one is called Suicide of the West, which is especially bad.
Yes,
because that is the same title as James Burnham's much superior book, which was Google bombed by fucking Goldberg. Now, if you search for Suicide of the West, you'll get a Jonah Goldberg book instead of his.
He did that on purpose. He knew what he was doing. I talked to him, even like Mark Hemingway. When I talked to Mark Hemingway, I was fired up about it, and like he worked at the National Review, and he was fired up about what Goldberg did with that one. But let's see.
It's a terrible book as well. Really bad book.
Of course.
Anyway,
yeah.
carry on.
Cringe Walker says maybe Castro's business skips every generation. Yeah, no, that would be the only explanation for Castro if our suspicions are true. All right, guys, we made it through all the super chat. I want to thank everybody for coming by. This has been a great time. Really enjoyed it. Of course, I've placed the link to go and buy AA's book. You should 100% do that. We only touched the very surface, and there's lots of important stuff you need to learn in here. Also, like he said, the footnotes are very thorough, so it's not just him throwing a bunch of ideas together. There's documentation and that kind of thing laid out. So you should definitely check that out. You should obviously, I can't imagine any of you aren't subscribed to AA, but his channel links are down here. Oh, we got one more super chat real quick. We'll try to grab before they go. Edward Winston for $5. Thank you very much. AA, your current take on Steve Bannon as a populist?
Well, see, the thing is with Bannon is that he should have been that elite organizer. And I just find it strange that he has all these contacts. He knows everybody who's everyone, And yet, in the end, what did he do? He kind of just made like a glorified talk radio show. You know, it's like, well, where's this arch strategist Steve Bannon? Like, where's the organization, Steve? And also, why was the communication between him and Trump so like? It should have been tighter. Do you know what I mean? Like everything's so informal and loose in the Trumpist camp that it was very easy to infiltrate and to fall apart. And I mean, I don't want to get into conspiracy, Auron, but part of me has even wondered whether it was deliberate. January the 6th, I thought like what was Trump doing? Why did he just run away? Why didn't he just have a plan? It's almost like he set everybody up. I'm not suggesting that he did. I'm just saying that he behaved like somebody who was deliberately sabotaging his own movement.
If he hadn't planned to, he might as well. Yeah. No, I think in that case it generally is down to incompetence or a lack of understanding the moment. Maybe is a better way to phrase it, but we'll have to rehash that another time. Narco Republican clarifies. Thank you again for your donation. For context, Castro and Che had an appointment with a presidential candidate that got assassinated. This triggered a massive riot known as the Bogotazo. Oh, okay. So they and then maybe the assassinated candidate without the leadership, the people who revolted didn't follow through. Interesting. Okay. I was unaware of that, but thank you for explaining that. All right, guys. So like I was saying, make sure you check out all of AA's stuff. Make sure you go ahead and buy the book. If this is your first time by my channel, and there are quite a few new watchers here, I can tell, please go ahead and subscribe, all that kind of stuff. I want to personally thank Easter Worshipper and Nurkish for helping make these streams possible. If you would like to be thanked for being someone who helps out, you can go ahead and check out the link to my Subscribestar. I'm also putting out once a month exclusive videos to Subscribestar. I'm going to try to get the one for this month done here next week. So if you want to be able to watch that, go ahead and check that out and support there. Again, guys, I appreciate everybody for coming and get by. AA, thank you so much. I think this has been a great conversation.
Thanks, Auron. Anytime.
All right, guys, everybody, have a good one. And as always, we'll talk to you next time.